Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor. And it is time for my 10 best reads of 2022. Yes, my top 10 reads of 2022. And I know what you're saying. It's not the end of 2022 yet. I know. But I thought I'd do this now because actually, on this list of my top 10 reads of 2022, I'm not actually including rereads, except for one thing, and there's a reason for that, and I'll explain that when I get to it. And I feel like I can do this now because I'm basically going to be reading Edgar Rice Burroughs books for the deep dive for the rest of the year. And if I did include rereads, it would just be all Tarzan and John Carter all over the list. So, because obviously they're the best. I know there are some people that have disagreed with me about The Son of Tarzan being a literary masterpiece. It's a masterpiece! Anyway, let us move on to my list, my top 10 lists. I wrote them all down so I wouldn't forget what my top 10 list was. The 10 best books that I've read this year that I've never read before, with one exception. We're going to go 10 to 1, as we do in these sorts of lists. So number 10, Fallon by Louis L'Amour. Fallon by Louis L'Amour. So I read this book for June on the Range, the reading event that I created to celebrate Western fiction. And I read some Westerns that I had never read before, and this really impressed me. Now, Louis L'Amour, I really like Louis L'Amour. I've read a lot of his books. Maybe even most of his books, but maybe not, because he's written a lot of books. But this one I had never read before, and it was just a really enjoyable Western with some great scenes and wonderful moments, and Fallon was a great character, so I really enjoyed it. Louis L'Amour, man, he always delivers. So that was number 10. Moving on to number 9. The Forsaken Boy by Troy Tradup. The Forsaken Boy by Troy Tradup. This was a werewolf novel. I actually read 3 werewolf novels this year. I read The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Endore. And this one, which I just have sitting around over here, this is The Last Werewolf by Glenn Duncan. I'm sorry, Glenn Duncan, you're not as good as Troy Tradup, and your story of a sexually obsessed werewolf was good. This was good. I liked it, but it wasn't as good as The Forsaken Boy. Forsaken Boy was better, and I enjoyed it, and it's at number 9 on my list of the 10 best books I read this year. So, moving on to number 8. The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. Excellent ghost story. Really creepy. It starts off, leisurely. Starts off good, but just it gets really good. And man, it has a tough ending. This one's good. This was better than I expected it to be. The Woman in Black. This was an excellent book. So yeah, Susan Hill, The Woman in Black. If you haven't read this and you like horror, definitely read this one. Okay. So that was The Woman in Black. But now we're going to talk about a different ghost story. Ghost Story by Peter Straub. Ghost Story by Peter Straub. So we did lose Peter Straub, unfortunately, which was some sad news this year. And this was my first Peter Straub book. Shockingly, I don't know how I've gone through my entire life as a reader and have never read a Peter Straub book, but this is the one. This is his most popular book, his most well-known book. and I didn't know what to expect. And it's very much written as a kind of M.R. James type of ghost story. It's a ghost story, but in that vein. And it's really successful at that. Really creepy horror story. I like this one a lot, Ghost Story. So it has a good reputation, and I think it deserves that reputation. I really enjoyed it. So Ghost Story is number 7. Number 6, Jirel of Jory by C.L. Moore. Jirel of Jory by C.L. Moore. These were stories featuring Jirel of Jory, a female fantasy hero from the 1930s. You didn't get many of those, especially one as tough and capable as Jirel. And these stories are just really weird. I mean, they were published in Weird Tales, so, you know, they should be weird, but not everything that was published in Weird Tales lived up to the name. These stories really do. They're really weird, really excellent fantasy stories, and they're so strange that they have lived on in my memories and my thoughts. I will often think back to those stories and some of the bizarre imagery that could be found in them. And Jirel is just an excellent character. So, yeah, I think Jirel deserves a place in the top 10 this year because I really enjoyed it, and I really think about this collection of stories like all the time. It was really good. I'm gonna have to reread this one of these days. So that was number 6. Number 5, The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, which is a book of short stories which are her versions of legends and fairy tales, only they're very much her versions of them. And they are also horror stories for the most part, and fantasy, and just really unique and interesting and deep in some cases. They're good stories. They're great reads. Again, another book that I think about an awful lot. Full of complex stuff. Many of the complex things probably went over my dopey head, but great book, man. Great book. So The Bloody Chamber is number 5, which brings me to number 4. The Good Old Stuff, edited by Gardner Dozois. So this was a science fiction anthology celebrating classic science fiction stories. And man, there are some dynamite stories in this anthology. Another book that lives up to its name, The Good Old Stuff. This really is good old stuff. And I had a wonderful time reading these classic science fiction stories. You know, classic science fiction is kind of my thing. If I could only read one genre, it would be science fiction. And I love classic science fiction. And so, yeah, this really hit home for me. It was a great book. I highly recommend it. If you could find this anthology, it's well worth getting. So if you find it on like eBay or something, pick it up. It's excellent. So that brings us, we're already at the top 3. Number 3, Shogun. Shogun by James Clavell. Shogun. So I knew this was going to be good because I had just heard too many good things about this book. So I knew it was going to be good, but man, was it long. And so that was a little daunting. But this year, I went in thinking I'm just going to read a bunch of mammoths this year. That didn't really happen. But this is one of the mammoths that I read, one of the really big books that I read. Actually, all 3 of my top books are giant books. So this was just so entertaining. It was huge, but I wouldn't lose a page of it. I enjoyed it from start to finish. It never, to me, in my estimation, it never slowed down or got dull or had any boring spots like a lot of super, super long books do. No, this one, the pace was pretty steady and the characters were interesting and they got gradually more interesting as the book went on. It started off actually with a kind of pulpy feel. It had kind of a pulp adventure feel at times. But it kind of kept that. But the characters sort of took over this story. And they were fascinating characters. And the hero of this story was not the hero I expected. It wasn't the main character that you think of when you think of Shogun. Someday I will do a Shogun review. People have been reminding me, you never did that Shogun review you said you were going to do. Sorry, I'll get to that eventually. Number 2, let's move on to number 2. Now this is the exception that I was talking about because this is kind of a reread and it's an anthology of sorts. This is the big book of the Continental Op by Dashiell Hammett. That's number 2. The reason I'm including it, even though I've read most of the stuff in here, I thought I had, when I bought this, I figured, I had read all of this. And I even put it on my 100 best books list. Even though I hadn't read this book, I've read all the Continental Op, I thought. So I thought I was safe to put this on that list. Now, after I've actually read this actual collection, I might even put this higher on that list. Because not only did it have a couple shorter stories that I had never read from the Continental Op, which is Dashiell Hammett's original detective, one of the most influential detective characters. But there's the novel Red Harvest, which is one of Dashiell Hammett's greatest novels. This has the original magazine version of Red Harvest called the Poisonville. Was it The Gutting of Poisonville? Something. See, now I'm forgetting because I always think of it as Red Harvest, but it has the original version of Red Harvest in it. And it's very different, actually. It's more different than I expected. It has scenes that were cut out of the original book version. A lot of things were changed. The magazine version has... It's a lot more violent. I mean, it was a violent book already in the published version. This version is even more violent. And it's got more of a pulpy feel. It's got a really good pace to it. For me, it was just a far superior version of the story. It also has the Dane Curse in this, has the original magazine version of the Dane Curse, which I didn't feel was as different. But certainly just for this version of Red Harvest alone that I hadn't read, that puts this book close to the top. In many years, I think this book probably would have been my top book, but it's not. Number 1, my number 1 greatest read of the year is Lonesome Dove. Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. So I kept hearing my whole life, it seems like, ever since it was published anyway, how this is the greatest Western ever written. I was suspicious and skeptical of that claim. First of all, because this is another gigantic book, and I'm like, a gigantic Western? To me, Westerns have always been shorter, because I've read so many paperback Westerns, and they're usually pretty short, to the point, action-packed stories. This is a mammoth. And so I couldn't imagine that it would be able to sustain its greatness throughout the whole of its pages. But I found that everything people had said about this book is true. This book is wonderful. It's tremendously entertaining. And you get really involved in the characters. And it's emotionally hard-hitting, actually. When you first start this book, it doesn't seem like it's going to be that. it seemed almost like it had kind of a light touch at the start of it. But you do get really emotionally involved in this, and some pretty terrible things happen in this book, actually. This is a heavy book at times. So I was surprised by it. I shouldn't have been. Too many people had told me this book was great. I should not have been surprised, but I was. I admit it. And this was by far the best book I read this year. Really, it's not much of a contest. I can't see any other book that I read this year really competing too much with this. So yeah, that was it. That was my top 10 best reads for 2022. So there you go. I will catch you next time.